The Book of the Dead was never meant to be read like a story. It was not written for entertainment, not written for comfort, not written to explain death in a poetic way. It was written for one reason only: to survive what comes next. In ancient Egypt, dying was not the end, but it was not a release either. Death was the moment you became vulnerable, the moment your identity could break apart, the moment your name could disappear, the moment your soul could fail to continue. And the Egyptians believed the afterlife was not a single destination. It was a sequence, a passage through gates, darkness, interrogations, and irreversible thresholds, a journey with rules that did not forgive ignorance. This is why the Book of the Dead existed, not as scripture, as equipment, a collection of spells, declarations, names, and instructions designed to guide the soul through the most dangerous transition a human could face. And to understand what this book truly was, we must begin with the first truth the Egyptians believed about death. You do not simply arrive in the afterlife, you must move through it, step by step. In modern religion, the afterlife often begins with judgment. A soul dies, appears before a divine authority, and is placed into reward or punishment. But the Egyptian afterlife did not begin at judgment. It began at disorientation, because death removed anchors. A living person is held together by routine, breath, body, memory, community. When the body stops, the world does not. Everything continues without you, and the Egyptians feared what that meant. A soul without anchors can scatter. So the first job of the afterlife was not reward, it was stabilization. And the Book of the Dead offered stabilization through one thing: words, not just language, correct language, spoken precisely, in the correct order, at the correct moment. Because the Egyptians believed words had force. Words could open gates. Words could repel threats. Words could restore identity when identity began to slip. This is why the Book of the Dead is filled with formulas, not poetry for the living, commands for the dead. The Egyptians did not call it the Book of the Dead. That name came later. They called it the Book of Going Forth by Day, which sounds beautiful until you understand what it implies. It implies that most souls did not go forth. It implies that the afterlife was dark enough that daylight had to be earned. That movement had to be secured. To go forth by day meant you were no longer trapped. You had crossed the maze, you had stabilized, you had returned into light. But before that, there was the Duat, and the Duat did not welcome souls. It tested them. So what was the Book of the Dead exactly? It was not one single book. There was no official edition, no single author. It was a flexible compilation of texts, copied and customized across centuries. Some versions were short, others long. Some contained dozens of spells, others contained nearly 200. It was often written on papyrus and placed in tombs, folded beside the mummy like a weapon hidden for a later battle. Sometimes spells were carved into coffins, painted onto tomb walls, inscribed onto amulets, woven into linen, not for decoration, for survival, because the Egyptians believed the soul needed tools, and the Book of the Dead was the greatest toolkit ever written for the journey after death. Before the soul could travel, it needed something stable behind it. That stability was the body. This is why mummification mattered. The Egyptian afterlife was not a belief system where the body was irrelevant. The body was an anchor point, a fixed reference. The soul could move, yes, but it needed something it could return to, something the universe could recognize as its origin. Mummification was not vanity. It was engineering. The goal was not beauty. The goal was continuity. Salt dried the flesh. Resin sealed it. Linen protected it. And each layer was not merely physical. It was symbolic reinforcement. A declaration that this person was not allowed to dissolve, not allowed to vanish. And in the Book of the Dead, protection spells often begin here. Protect the body, protect the name, protect the passage. Because if identity collapses at the beginning, nothing that comes later matters. In the Egyptian afterlife, the soul was not assumed to be known. It had to declare itself. The afterlife was filled with gates, and gates asked questions. Not, "Are you good?" but, "Who are you?" Name yourself. Name the gate. Name the guardian. Speak the formula. If you could not answer, you did not proceed. This is why the Book of the Dead repeats the name of the deceased constantly, because a name was more than a label. It was a structural key. If the name survived, the person could survive. If the name disappeared, the person could be erased. That is why tombs were covered in inscriptions. That is why statues carried carved cartouches. That is why memory was sacred, because in Egypt, to be forgotten was not sadness. It was death. The Duat was not hell. It was not a realm of punishment. It was a system of testing, a maze, a sequence of regions that shifted as the night moved, and every night, Ra crossed it. The solar bark traveled through 12 hours of darkness, fighting disruption, maintaining order. The dead followed the same structure, because the Duat was not only a place for souls, it was where existence defended itself from collapse. And when you entered it, you entered pressure. The Book of the Dead did not promise safety, it promised guidance. And guidance was the only thing that separated the dead who continued from those who disappeared. The Duat was not stable. That was what made it lethal. It did not behave like a fixed underworld you could memorize visually. It unfolded in stages, hour by hour, gate by gate, and each stage demanded one thing the dead could easily lose: coherence. A living person remains coherent through the body. Death removes the body as a function. It removes breath, warmth, motion. It removes the everyday anchors that keep a mind stable. So the Egyptian afterlife began with an emergency. Hold together, because the first danger after death was not fire, demons, or punishment. It was fragmentation, the soul scattering before it even reached the threshold of judgment. This is why the Book of the Dead becomes more than a guide. It becomes a structure that holds the soul in place, a script to keep your identity from dissolving, a weapon made of language. The Egyptians believed the underworld was secured, not by walls, by recognition. The Duat was filled with gates that did not open for the unprepared. Each gate had a name. Each gate had guardians. Each guardian had its own name as well, and the soul had to know them. This is where the Book of the Dead becomes terrifyingly practical, because many spells are not mystical poetry. They are direct access codes. They read like procedures. I know you. I know your name. I know the name of this gate. I know the one who watches it. To the Egyptians, names were not labels. Names were keys. To know a name was to establish control through recognition. A guardian could not stop you if you recognized it properly, not because the guardian was kind, because the system was designed that way. It was a world that responded to correct order. Wrong order meant failure, and failure did not mean punishment. Failure meant stopping, and stopping inside the Duat meant disappearing. Some gates asked questions. Some gates demanded silence. Some gates demanded a specific phrase spoken in a specific hour. There was no improvisation, no guessing, no pleading. The Book of the Dead existed to remove uncertainty, to ensure the soul arrived with what it needed, because in the afterlife, there were no second attempts. Step 5. The dead must speak, or they cease. Here is something most people don't realize. The Egyptians believed a dead soul could lose its voice, not metaphorically, functionally, and losing the ability to speak was catastrophic, because speech in the Egyptian afterlife was not expression, it was function. Speech opened passage. Speech asserted identity. Speech defended coherence. Many spells exist only to protect speech itself, to protect the mouth, the tongue, the ability to name oneself. Because if you could not speak, you could not proceed. and if you could not proceed, you were trapped. And being trapped in the Duat was not eternal imprisonment, it was slow collapse. A dead soul that could not move eventually dissolved. The Book of the Dead called this fate in different forms, but the meaning was the same: loss of continuity, the second death. In the Duat, shape was not guaranteed. A soul could be attacked by forces that did not tear flesh. They tore identity. They pulled parts of the soul apart, the BA drifting away, the Ka weakening, the name fading. This is why so many spells sound like protection rituals. I will not be taken. I will not be trapped. I will not be turned back. I will not be made to forget. Because forgetting was lethal, not emotionally, structurally. If you forgot your name, you lost your anchor. If you forgot the gate, you lost your path. If you forgot the words, you lost your motion. And motion was survival. Now we arrive at the moment everyone thinks comes first: judgment. But judgment was not the beginning of the afterlife. It was the end of the maze. The Hall of Two Truths was deep. Only those who survived gates, darkness, pressure, and fragmentation reached it. Most did not. And this is the terrifying meaning behind the scale. The scale was not meant for everyone. It was meant for survivors. And those survivors did not arrive clean. They arrived worn, their coherence strained by the Duat, their identity tested repeatedly, which meant the heart they carried was exposed. If it was heavy, it dragged, not physically, existentially. It caused hesitation, it caused error, it caused collapse before judgment even began. In a way, the Duat itself was a prejudgment, a filter. Only those whose hearts did not sabotage them under pressure even arrived at the final measurement. Inside the Hall of Two Truths, the dead spoke declarations. Statements often called the negative confession. I have not stolen. I have not murdered. I have not caused suffering. I have not lied. Modern minds see this as morality, but the Egyptians were doing something sharper. They were declaring alignment. They were asserting that their life did not add weight to chaos, that their pattern matched Ma'at, that their existence reinforced order. But here is the cold truth. The scale did not measure the confession. The scale measured the heart. A soul could speak perfection and still fail, because words were not weight. Weight was accumulated reality. The heart was placed on one side, the feather of Ma'at on the other. The feather was not fragile, it was exact. It represented cosmic balance, truth, order, stability, and the heart represented a life compressed into substance. If the heart was lighter than the feather, alignment held. If the heart was heavier, the scale tipped, and if the scale tipped, there was no debate, only consequence. Amit waited beside the scale, not as a demon, as a function. Part crocodile, part lion, part hippo. Amit did not punish, she finalized. If the heart failed, it was consumed, and the soul was erased, not tortured, deleted. The second death, the end of return, the end of memory, the end of existence within the system. If the Book of the Dead is a guide, then one question matters more than all the others. What does it actually mean to survive? Not to be forgiven, not to be good. To survive, in the Egyptian sense, meant to remain coherent under pressure, because the underworld did not work like a moral courtroom. It worked like a system with thresholds, with gates, with exact conditions. A system that filtered what could continue into eternity and removed what could not. This is why the Book of the Dead feels so procedural, because it was never meant to inspire feelings. It was meant to prevent collapse. Modern minds want the afterlife to be emotional, to have mercy, to have forgiveness, to have exceptions. But the Egyptians built their afterlife on something colder, Ma'at, cosmic order. Ma'at was not simply morality, it was the structure that kept reality from collapsing. The rising sun, the return of the Nile, the continuity of time, These things depended on Mayat being maintained. So judgment was not about virtue as a feeling, it was about alignment as a condition. If your life reinforced Mayat, your heart stayed light. If your life violated it repeatedly, your heart became heavy. Not because a god hated you, because disorder accumulates. A heavy heart was not sin, it was density, a lifetime of misalignment compressed into weight. And when the scale measured it, weight could not argue. Egyptian death was not simply going somewhere, it was becoming something. The dead were not automatically complete, they had to become complete. The Book of the Dead offers spells that rebuild the dead's structure piece by piece. Spells to preserve the name, spells to protect the face, spells to keep the heart from betraying the soul, spells to keep the body from decaying beyond recognition. Because in Egypt, identity was not a single object, it was a configuration, and configurations can break. That is why the Book of the Dead does not assume stability, it constantly reinforces it. This is the part most people never hear. The goal of the Egyptian afterlife was not to become a ghost, it was to become an Ak. An Ak was not simply a dead person. An Ak was a dead person who had successfully integrated, a luminous being, a coherent form, a stabilized existence, someone who could move between realms without breaking apart. The Egyptians believed that if you passed judgment and maintained coherence, you became effective, not powerless, not forgotten, effective. You could go forth by day. You could appear again, move freely, return to the world in permitted ways. This is why the Book of the Dead uses the phrase going forth by day, because survival was not only avoiding erasure, it was earning mobility. It was earning light. Daylight was not automatic in the underworld. Daylight had to be reached. The Duat was the night system, the place of pressure, gates, and danger. To go forth by day meant you were no longer trapped in night logic. It meant you had crossed the maze. You had stabilized. You had become Ak. You were no longer merely dead. You were integrated. In this state, the afterlife was not darkness. It was ordered existence. But ordered existence still required maintenance. And that is why the living mattered. Offerings fed the Ka. Remembrance stabilized the name. Rituals protected continuity. The Egyptians did not imagine death as separation. They imagined it as a new kind of dependence. The Book of the Dead repeats the imagery of Ra's night journey because it served as the ultimate template. Ra crossed the Duat every night, not because he was punished, because order must be maintained. Every night the solar bark moved through darkness. Every night Apophis rose as interruption. Every night the gods fought to prevent stoppage, and every morning the sun returned. Not because chaos was defeated forever, because it was restrained again. The Egyptians understood this as the deepest truth of the universe. Order is an action, not a state. So the dead followed the same logic. To survive the Duat was to maintain motion through pressure, to resist stoppage, to hold coherence when the system tried to fragment you. Many spells in the Book of the Dead look strange to modern readers. They speak of becoming a bird, becoming a lotus, becoming fire, becoming a serpent, becoming a star. This seems like fantasy. But it is not meant as fantasy. These transformations represent stability under specific conditions. A bird moves. Movement prevents stagnation. A lotus reemerges. Reemergence means continuity. Fire repels darkness. Repelling darkness means coherence remains active. A star is fixed in cosmic order. Fixedness resists collapse. The Book of the Dead provides forms that hold up under pressure, not because they are poetic, because they work. Here is another terrifying belief. The Egyptians feared the heart could testify against the soul, that the heart, as a record, could speak, could reveal, could accuse. This is why some spells attempt to silence the heart, not because the Egyptians wanted to lie, because they feared collapse under exposure. They feared the heart would weigh itself down by revealing too much. The Book of the Dead contains spells that plead with the heart. Do not stand against me. Do not betray me. Do not become heavy, because the heart was not an ally by default. It was evidence, and evidence is indifferent. The Book of the Dead was not a promise. It was preparation, because in ancient Egypt, the afterlife did not reward belief. It rewarded readiness. A soul that survived the Duat was not simply good, it was coherent. It remembered its name. It spoke the right words. It crossed the gates. It held itself together under pressure. And when it finally stood before the scale, the outcome was not emotional. It was structural. The feather of Maat did not bend. The standard did not change. A light heart meant alignment. A heavy heart meant collapse. And failure did not lead to punishment. It led to erasure, the second death. Not suffering, not fire, but disappearance. That was the true fear of Egypt, to be removed from memory, from return, from continuity itself. But if the soul passed, it continued, not into a fantasy, into stability, into the field of reeds. A world shaped like Egypt because familiarity preserved identity, a place where order could be lived without breaking, and this is the final truth the Book of the Dead reveals. Eternity was never automatic. It was maintained, like the sun itself, crossing darkness every night, like Ra, moving through the Duat hour by hour, like order resisting chaos without end. So the Book of the Dead was never just a book. It was a map, a weapon made of language, a step-by-step guide to surviving the only journey that could not be repeated. Because once you enter the afterlife, the maze does not forgive confusion, and the scale does not listen, it only measures.